Hi everyone, so welcome to the second lecture. All right, and we are also going to continue with what we were discussing earlier. So I'm going to share the screen. This is also part of your memory metaphors and lifelong learning. All right, and we are focusing on the memory section. Okay, so I am going to share my screen. All right, and I hope it is visible to everybody. Yeah, I think it should be. Yes. Okay, so particularly, we have looked at how memories are formed and memories are stored. Okay, we have gone over that. Um, we have looked at how memories are reconstructed. Okay, how that makes memories dynamic and not just static. All right, so we have gone over all of it. We have also differentiated between long-term memories and short-term memories. Okay, so we have gone over all of that. Okay, so now we are going to look at what is the we have also looked at the study of memory functions in modern day. Okay, what's the significance of studying memory functions? And we have also looked at how individual memory becomes collective memory. All right, so we have also explored that particular aspect. So right now we are going to look at applications of memory to other aspects of studies of culture. Basically, what we are trying to do is we are going to 1 second. Yes, so now we are going to look at, we have looked at how personal memory becomes collective memory and what are the significance of the transformation of personal memory into collective memory. So right now we are going to look at the applicabilities, okay, the applicabilities of the study of memory to culture. All right, so that is also a very important part of our study. So we are going to look at post-colonial and decolonial approaches to memory. Okay, so post-colonial theorists, for example, Michael Rothberg's multidirectional memory, okay, Astrid Ariel's traveling memory, and various global Scout scholars of memory studies critique Eurocentric trauma models and highlight how colonial legacies shape memory. Okay, so again, very significant. Michael Rothberg's argument about multidirectional memory is particularly important because what he says is that memory does not memories of oppression are interconnected with each other. Okay, so if you are looking at the memory of the Holocaust, all right, in Germany during the Second World War, then studying that in isolation is not doing justice, okay, to similar forms of trauma elsewhere. All right, and also justice to what had occurred, because somehow you find that building interconnections between traumatic events actually help you understand that traumatic event better. All right, so Michael Rothberg writes very, very extensively on that particular idea. Okay, so it's important to take note of it. And then you have Astrid Ariel's traveling memory. Okay, right. Yes. So we were looking at Astrid Ariel's concept of traveling memory, and that is also significant if we place it in relation to Michael Rothberg's argument about memory. Okay. So, um, you know, Michael Rothberg argues that at even deeper conceptual level, okay, what constitutes a culture is no longer tenable, all right, because um, because discrete, homogeneous, and social groups are bearers of memory, and how they form culture depends on how they exchange memories between each other. Okay, and Astrid Erl, ERLL, has usefully traced this assumption back to a conception of container culture. Okay, a conception that persists in much recent work on collective memory. Okay, so that is very significant. There is an isomorphy between territory, social formation, mentalities, and memories that blocks recognition of a transcultural dynamics. All right, so very significant. So she is actually saying that we need to argue against it. Okay, container cultures signify that cultures become isomorphic to the territories in which they to which they are native. Okay, to the people who practice them, who are part of that culture, and to the memories that circulate in that particular in that particular zone. So it becomes difficult to build a transcultural dynamics. Okay, so that is the argument that is being made by Astrid Earle. All right. And we have already looked at Michael Rothberg's argument, okay, with regards to multidirectional memory. Okay. So, particularly if you think about multicultural, you can even replace that with transcultural or transnational. Okay, something that allows you to form international networks. Okay, that help process different kinds of traumatic events. All right, so that is very significant to take note of. Um, so, thinking of memory as transcultural means seeking to break through the isomorphic imagination that underpins still valuable, ideas such as Holbach's collective memory. Okay, collective memory being the memory that is specific to a culture. All right, so that is very significant to take into account. So, post colonial theorists such as Michael Rothberg have argued for multidirectional memory. Astrid Earle has argued for traveling memory, and several kinds of global South scholars have also focused on how memory is integral to the formation of a culture's identity. Okay, and in that regard, it is also integral to shaping transnational dialogues. All right, so that is very significant to take into account, and all of them brought together critique Eurocentric trauma models. All right, so they kind of challenge the idea that there is only one dominant narrative um, you know, of records of genocide, for example. All right, Eurocentric trauma model would necessarily argue that what happened in the Holocaust is very specific to the Jewish identity of Europe. Okay, and that it needs to be seen as a specific event occurring in a particular time. And of course, that is correct. But Michael Rothberg is arguing that various forms of traumas need to be interconnected together. It's not that you are discrediting one kind of trauma by giving attention to another one. Not at all. He's arguing that these different kinds of traumatic experiences, cultural traumatic experiences, need to be brought in dialogue together uh, in order to analyze how colonial legacies and oppressive world orders shape memory. All right, so that is a very significant argument being made by Rothberg. Um, so what they are exploring is, how memories get entangled across geographies. Okay, how memories get entangled across geographies. The politics of forgetting colonial violence. Okay, how you forget colonial violence is also very significant. As I mentioned to you earlier, you have seen British colonialism perpetrating man-made famines. Okay, it perpetrated the man-made famine in Ireland in 1845, between 1845 to 1852. It perpetrated a man-made famine in Bengal, India, between in 1943. So you find that despite these events recurring during the period of colonization, post-colonization in countries such as Ethiopia and countries such as Sudan, you find that that same repressive colonial style mechanism is brought back. Okay, famine is introduced as a form of population control. Okay, as a form of regulating population, very much like very much a tool of biopolitics. It's all brought in together. So that is very important to explore. And finally, you have to understand how post-colonial societies negotiate remembrance, reparative justice, and nation building. Okay, so that is also very significant because post-colonial societies and have to be have to be actively involved in remembering in remembering the colonially induced traumatic events that have occurred in the past. All right, so very significant. You find that countries such as Ireland actually do that very well. Okay, for example, you have sculptures by Rowan Gillespie on memorializing the famine. Okay, putting those emaciated bodies in sculptural form for everyone to remember what colonialism perpetrated in Ireland. Okay, killing more than 10% of the population is decreed um, as inflicting harm across generations. Okay, and that is precisely what had happened in Ireland. Okay, and irrespective of such situations, you find that colonial countries, okay, such as India, you find countries with a history of colonization, such as India, the ability to remember colonially induced trauma is slightly put to the margins. Okay, because you find that you had the Bengal famine happen in 1943, and yet to a large extent that memory has been repressed. For instance, it is very difficult, you could argue that it is very difficult to bring certain of those memories to light. Okay, it's certain of the memories into contemporary discourse, because first, it is still traumatic for many. Okay, many people are still hungry. Many people still go hungry in Bengal and in a daily basis. So the memory of the famine is still very palpable. Okay, you could argue that it's one of the reasons. There's still a lot of psychological trauma associated with the experience of hunger. Okay, in Bengal particularly, with a large number of people going hungry on a daily basis, and also it could be politically dangerous as well. Okay, so there are all of these there are all of these concerns that one has to take into account. um, when thinking about how do colonized countries remember acts of colonial violence. All right, and what kind of reparative justice can they seek, what kind of acts of nation building can they engage in? These are all the things that one is uh, implored to think about when one is studying process of memory formation, looking at how personal memory becomes collective memory. Okay, so all of that is interconnected with each other. And next, you have memory as ideological and affective. Okay, so critical theorists influenced by the Frankfurt School, for example, Adorno and Benjamin Foucault, and later affect theory, they all analyze memory as an ideological apparatus that reinforces hegemony or enables resistance. Okay, memory is tied to emotion, embodiment, and materiality. Okay, and can be manipulated for nationalist, capitalist, or authoritarian purposes. So again, very very significant. Memory, particularly, is um, memory of a collective. Okay, how a collective group of the population remembers incidents, how things have occurred. That actually affects the ways in which government functions, the way in which they can reinforce hegemony. For example, if you celebrate a festival, okay, and the way in which you celebrate a festival with some amount of joy, with some amount of you know with some amount of maybe happiness. All right, so that is actually looked at by the government as tools of controlling the population. So the government can then decide what kind of ways in which it can control the celebration of a festival, what kind of ways in which it can bring together all of these emotional investments in one particular national event in order to uh, galvanize um, a certain kind of political a political and ideological stance. All right, so all of that actually comes into play when you are thinking about memory as affective, okay, and memory as being instrumentalized by governments in order to control the population, certainly, or in order to kind of control how a population functions, what a population does, all of that. Okay, so memory is tied to emotion, embodiment, and materiality and can be manipulated for nationalist, capitalist, or authoritarian purposes. And that you see happening all the time. Okay, um, I'm not going to go into how it happens. It is very, it's very apparent that authoritarian powers actually marginalize certain communities, certain groups of people in order to put the memories of a certain other group of people in order to foreground the memories of certain other group of people. So that is how it functions in in a large basis, okay, in a regular basis. So next you have critical interventions and contemporary directions. Okay. So recent work, for example, in critical memory studies, new approaches by Brett Ashley Kaplan expands the field to include race, environment, digital memory, decolonial critique, and post-human perspectives. It interrogates how memory intersects with monuments, museums, activism. Okay, so particularly when you go and visit a monument, all right, you are engaging with the history of that place, all right, and your personal memory is intersecting with the memory of your surroundings. All right, it is intersecting with the history associated with those monuments, with the history associated with those museums. Okay, so that is a very significant kind of thing to consider. Yes, so now we are going to look at critical inventions, like I said, critical inventions and contemporary directions to to approaches to memory studies. So, memories actually expands the field to include race, environment, digital memory, decolonial critique, and post human perspectives. So, all of that is very significant to the study of memory. It interrogates how memory intersects, as I said, with monuments, museums, and forms of activism, and also global crisis. So, that is also very significant to take into account because you might have a particular kind of traumatic memory associated with your culture. Okay, you might have had some form of leader being assassinated, by either colonization or by the government, some leader that you idealized. All right, and that becomes a form of traumatic cultural memory. Okay, and particularly what is important is to see that not as a peripheral occurrence, okay, not as memory that is peripheral to global events, but to actually put that in relation to other traumatic events, okay, that have occurred around the world. Okay, so that is what is being argued. Okay, and that is what we kind of need to underline. All right. So next you have collective memory. Okay, collective memory is not individual recollection but a group phenomenon. Okay, so we are going to explore how collective memory is not individual recollection. So Maurice Holbach argued that memory is inherently social. Okay, individuals can only remember within the frameworks provided by the social groups they belong to. All right, family, class, nation, religious community. Okay, so that is very, very significant. Okay, we have looked at how memory is being processed, okay, by the individual. All right. Particularly now we are extending it to the study of, social groups, to the formation of social groups. And, we are saying that families first, you kind of, you enlarge your circle in little steps. So first you have your family, then you have the class, then you have the nation, um, sorry, then you have, the communities, all right, and then you have the nation. So that is how your social groups are formed, and that is what informs your memory, the structure of your memory. And personal memories are shaped, filtered, and given meaning through interaction with others. Okay, so that is also very significant. Personal memories are constantly, shaped. As I said in the very beginning, the first lecture, personal memories are dynamic. They are not static. Okay, so they're already like, they're being shaped and filtered and given meaning through interaction with other personal memories of others. Okay, so that is very significant to take into account. Next, you have memories being reconstructed through social frameworks. Okay, so there's a certain way in which memory functions through social frameworks. So Maurice Holbach emphasizes that there is no pure or private memory. Okay, so again, very significant. What we remember is continuously reconstructed in line with current needs, values, and identity of the group. So this is something we went over in the first lecture as well. So what it means is that you might have certain kinds of false memories coming into your memory framework. All right, your what you take to be your private memory, certain false memories might enter into it. Something that you have heard, okay, somewhere else, something that you have seen somewhere else. So those things kind of infiltrate into your private memory. Okay, which is why it's said that memories are always reconstructed through social framework. Somebody might have told you, oh, you remember that happening in this manner. Actually, I remember it happening in that manner. And then when you listen to it, you remember that, okay, maybe it had actually happened in the other manner. All right, so that is what is important to take note of. The past is selectively recalled or forgotten depending on what reinforces the group's present cohesion and legitimacy. Okay, so again, very significant. The past is always being recalled, as well as forgotten, depending on what reinforces the group's present cohesion. Okay. Yes, so as I was saying, the past is always being reconstructed. Okay, so for example, the government that is in power at that time, at any given point of time, they get to control which kind of narratives they are going to select. Okay, because it serves a purpose. Okay, it serves a political purpose, and you just have to play into it. And if you don't play into it, you will be left out. Okay, so it's a very significant way in which memory functions collectively. It also manufactures a large number of, it also manufactures a large number of tyrants. All right, because it makes people into tyrants if you do not follow something. If you do not follow the dominant narrative, you will be, your individuality will be curtailed. So that is what happens. And alongside it, you also have, a manufacturing of sycophants who will, who will come into any kind, who will cater to any kind of narrative. Okay, who will fit themselves in any kind of mood in order to, appease the tyrant and kind of work along with the tyrant. So that is how power relationships function. Okay, so we have to take that very much into account. And that reinforces the group's present cohesion and legitimacy. Okay, that is what decides what will actually, hold the group together. Okay, so that is very significant to take into account. Next, you have the idea of cultural memory. So cultural memory is deliberately transmitted across generations. Okay, so that is also very significant to take note of. Jan and Alida Asman distinguish cultural memory from communicative memory. Okay, so cultural memory is institutionalized and objectified through texts, monuments, rituals, commemorative practices, museums, educational systems, and media. Okay, these figures of memory are consciously preserved and handed down, making the past a stable normative resource for group identity. So, again, very, very significant. Okay, so cultural memory is something that has already been given a solidified existence. Okay, it has already been solidified in text. It has, and it has been given a status of being, um, um, it has already been sanctified, if you like. Okay, you cannot challenge it. Okay, challenging it is like challenging a religious text almost. All right, so that is how cultural memory functions. For example, like I said, the memory of the famine. Okay, particularly in Bengal. So, you have documents existing about the famine, you have documents present, but largely, uh, you know, um, the way in which media presents it would naturally kind of determine how it becomes gradually institutionalized. Okay, so that is a very important role. You have all of these you have all of these media systems working, you have all of these archival systems working in order to determine how cultural memory gets institutionalized, how it gets sanctified. All right, so that is how cultural memory works. These figures of memory are consciously preserved and handed down, making the past a stable normative resource for group identity. So, again, very significant. The past becomes a stable resource for group identity. You can visit these archives, you can access these records, and then say that this is how this is what has shaped the collective cultural memory of our nation or of our community. So that is how collective cultural memory is formed, determined, all of that. Next, you have power relations. Power relations shape what is remembered and what is silenced. So, collective and cultural memory are shaped by institutions and dominant groups that control the means of representation. Okay, so again, very significant. As I just mentioned to you, the governments in power will be the people determining how the past is seen. Okay, and very recently, the president of Ireland, when she was meeting, the representative of Northern Ireland, they were having that discussion, and she said particularly that the past has been rewritten plenty of times in order to suit the narrative of the people who are in power. So that is a given across histories. Okay, it's a trans historical event. It always occurs, and there is nothing that one can do about it. Okay, so general lack of conscience, you could argue, it leads to dominant groups kind of reshaping pasts in order to suit their narratives. Yeah, so that is how it occurs. Certain narratives are privileged while others are marginalized, suppressed, or erased, even serving to maintain power structures and exclude alternative perspectives or counter memories. So that is also very significant. Okay, certain communities, certain ethnicities, certain racial identities, their memories are always put in the margins. All right, and the importance is always given to importance is always given to those communities and racial identities that are beneficial for the dominant group's narrative. All right, presents them in a better light. So that is very significant. Again, no, nothing can be done about it. It has continued for it has continued for ages, so one has to like comply with it largely. What one can do as a critic is to acknowledge that this has happened many times in the past, it will happen many times in the future, and what you can hold on to is just a certain sense of awareness, a certain sense of critical awareness, a certain sense of understanding of how memory functions. Okay, and like the process of learning, okay, to like imbibe it into your process of lifelong learning. All right, how do you structure a narrative for lifelong learning? So all of that kind of comes into play when you are looking at how power relations shape memories. Okay, so very significant to take it into account. Next, you have memory functions as an instrument of identity formation and exclusion. Okay, so again, very important to explore. So, through shared remembrance practices, rituals, and symbols, groups construct a sense of we versus they. Okay, so very important. Such a process simultaneously strengthens collective belonging and often marginalizes or delegitimizes the memories and experiences of outsiders, minorities, or defeated groups, making collective memory a site of both solidarity and social conflict. Okay, so again, very, very, very important to take into account. Um, it actually argues that memory functions as an instrument of identity and formation. All right, it simultaneously strengthens collective belonging. Okay, some groups uh, certain groups find it, they're, as Astrid Earl said, they're they're container cultures. Okay, they exist in they're very specific to their territory. Okay, they are closed off from mingling with other cultures. It is mostly because of traumatic experiences associated in their past, but somehow it somehow ends up marginalizing others. Okay, but then they would actually bring up the argument that they have been marginalized for many, many decades or centuries, so it is only right to marginalize others in return now. So it's a very, very convoluted kind of political argument, but it is important to keep that in mind. So you have, processes that strengthen collective belonging. Okay, but in doing so it also marginalizes other identities or delegitimizes other identities, shifts some memories to the margins. Okay, so all of that is taken into consideration when you are looking at memory functions. And also making collective memory a site of both solidarity and social conflict. So again, very important, collective memory becomes an important way of looking at exploring solidarities. Okay, um what how do groups form networks of solidarities? All right, so that also becomes an important part of memory, the study of memory, and also how it can influence the way in which we develop the process of lifelong learning. Okay, because lifelong learning necessitates one to be very aware of one's past, one's history, and also kind of be able to put those histories, put those pasts in relation with others. Okay, so that is very significant to take into account. And next, you have memory's role in processing trauma. Okay, so the politics of memory determines which traumas are officially acknowledged and which are silenced. Okay, so again, a very, very kind of an insidious politics at play. Okay, and like Michael Rothbard said, it is important to place different kinds of traumatic memories in relation with each other. Okay, in order to challenge any kind of colonial legacy or repressive legacy that might exist in constructing them as isolated events. You have to see memories of traumatic events not as isolated but always in relation with each other. And you find that that is, although that is the ideal case, you find that memories are often challenged. Memories of certain groups, certain people, certain ethnicities, they're always challenged and silenced. Okay, so very significant to take into account. States, institutions, and dominant groups decide which acts of violence, all right, genocide, colonialism, slavery, massacre, war crimes, state terror, okay, which kinds of acts of violence are commemorated and which ones are marginalized, denied, or even forgotten. Okay, so that is very significant to take into account. Such a selective remembrance shapes both historical legitimacy and present day power relations. All right. So again, very important. Like, it's important to look at how it how, again, very important, as you mentioned in the first lecture, memory is always uh, reconstructive. Okay, you're always actively reconstructing a memory. So what happens is that, through the act of reconstruction, you are also selecting which memories you remember, which memories you do not remember. Okay, so it is important to take it into account as well. Next, you have the idea of official memory that can serve as a tool of continued domination or reconciliation. Okay, so governments and elites often use memory politics to legitimize their rule. Okay, for example, glorifying heroic violence while erasing victimhood of oppressed groups, or conversely, to pursue transitional justice and healing. Okay, the choice between these paths deeply affects whether structural violence and inequality persist or begin to be dismantled. Okay, so very significant again. What is being argued is that, different governments, okay, governments and elites, they use memory politics. How certain groups remember certain incidents, okay, how certain racial identities remember certain, national events, okay. So they actually kind of use those kind of memory politics in order to paint certain groups as heroic, all right, and then make the others either victims or kind of completely erase their presence altogether from history. All right, so that is very significant to take into account. One good example of it is, the presence of the presence of Algerian soldiers in the French army. Okay, the presence of Caribbean soldiers in the British army during World War II, particularly, and you find that the identities of all of these soldiers, okay, who were, from black or other races other than white races, their identities were completely erased from official records, either erased or forcibly repressed. Okay, because the government or governments in power gets to decide uh, whose narratives they're going to focus on, which memories they will, legitimize, and which memories they will erase. So that is a very significant aspect of, how memories are used as a continued tool of domination or reconciliation. Now you can understand that at a national level. Okay, at a national level, when uh, the governments are actually trying to mask or camouflage the extent of their colonial power and the extent of their colonial rule. Okay, but you find that happening at a personal level as well in certain countries, and uh, that that seems very very inexplicable. Okay, even rationally you are unable to understand why it takes place at a personal level, perhaps in certain countries. So that is important to explore as well. Next, you have the idea of trauma. Okay, trauma becoming politically weaponized when memory is contested. Okay, so you find that groups that have suffered violence frequently, okay, uh, one second. Yeah. So, groups that have suffered violence frequently fight for recognition of their suffering in public memory. When recognition is denied, for example, Holocaust denial or denial of colonial atrocities, refusal to acknowledge genocide, for example, it constitutes secondary victimization and perpetuates trauma across generations. Okay, so again, very significant. All right. Particularly, you find that in certain cases, memory is contested. Okay, the memory of the Holocaust is contested. Okay, um, by groups that want to still victimize Jews. All right. So when that kind of a denial happens, what takes place is a form of secondary victimization, and that perpetrates trauma across generations. Okay. So that is very important to take note of. Again, you find that with regards to famine. Okay. You find that with regards to, Native Americans being pushed to reservations. All right, so that has largely remained the case. Okay, um, victimization of certain groups by building a dominant narrative for others. Okay, and that is how trauma is politically weaponized. Okay, when where some memories are contested and some memories are kind of brought to light. So those are the things to take into account. So one needs to be very careful, because erasure in order to suit a particular dominant political narrative is not the is not a is not the conscientious way of engaging with history. Okay, in order to engage with history, one needs to really look at the various layers of victimization that are at play. Okay, that one has to really look at the various ways in which trauma pervades memories of cultures. Okay, so those are the things that one really needs to look into when one is exploring power dynamics between the dominant group and the subservient group. So those are the things to keep in mind. Successful recognition, on the one hand, can validate experience and open space for repair. Okay, so again, very significant. Recognizing that memories can be contested, can be challenged, even erased. Okay, that helps to kind of validate experience as well. Okay, so I'm just going to